Hello, everyone. I'm here with Tristan Johnson. Tristan, how are you doing?
Not bad, not bad. It's Monday night, and I am not on bedtime duty, so I feel pretty good.
There we go. I think that's the most important thing. Making you can have the evening to yourself. I guess to talk with me, but yes. Tristan, for anyone else, who doesn't know, is a content creator. He has a YouTube channel. Started a YouTube channel called Step Back History Channel. And maybe Tristan, do you want to kind of give a little bit of a introduction for what made you interested in starting this channel that explores a lot about U.S. history and maybe North American history, kind of history and in politics, and yeah, what made you interested in this and doing the other content work that you do?
Sure. The my first attempt, I remember I made a video where I filmed somebody beatboxing on YouTube in 2007 when I was like, probably like 18 years old or something. And I've been always trying to take a stab at you. I've been fascinated by YouTube as a platform basically like since then. So pretty much since the beginning. But my primary thing, the reason I started Step Back specifically was because I have, I'd done a bunch of just kind of random things before, and I started Step Back about 10 years ago, it'll be 10 years this September, with the idea of having a more intentional strategy towards what I make and having everything a little bit more branded, because YouTube in the early days was much more of a social media platform than it is now. But I have an even longer history. Like, I've been politically active pretty much since, I would say probably since like 2002, 2003, when I was in high school. I got really into, or I got kind of activated by the Iraq War and the sort of post 9/11 war on terror period. And that combined with just, I grew up in a family that has a lot of interest in history. I've seen a lot of historical sites and road tripped around the U.S. quite a lot when I was young. So it all kind of amalgamated in me taking a real interest in history. And that combined with like the sort of justice angle, I over time just really knew that was a direction to go down. And after some other attempts at other things, I did a degree in history that I finished in 2013. And then I did a master's in American Cultural Studies that I finished in 2014. And then I did a master's in history that I finished in 2015. And so I actually started Step Back in September as I was starting a PhD program. And originally it was just sort of like YouTube in 2015 had worked very differently than it does today. And so it was very much like the high watermark of like the CGP Grey style 5-minute explainer video. And so I was doing that, but then 2016 came around and I realized that it was not really going to make a whole lot of sense to just kind of sit by the sidelines and do education, like random educational stuff, when I know the stuff I'm talking about has real world impact and real like gravitas. And I had been, I had done that in like my teaching, like as a TA and stuff like that, but I hadn't done it on YouTube, and I kind of started to step up. And that was around the same time that several other, kind of sort of a wave of left-wing content creators started to really appear on the platform and take off. And many of them were like colleagues and friends of mine. And so I kind of followed in their footsteps and their best practices. And then I kind of kept that going until today. And I for a while anyway, from like 2019 to 2024, I was a full-time content creator, and I'm not anymore. I miss it. I miss it a hell of a lot. But that's sort of like the real quick and dirty like answer of like how I ended up doing what I was doing. Is just, it was like an evolution of one thing in front of the other, based on the things that inspired me and activated me just as a person.
That makes total sense. I have often found that too. Most things in life it's like one step after the other. It's always based off of the previous thing. And I think one takeaway I have from this is I think you and I are officially about the same age, if I'm doing the math correctly, because I was also about 17 and 18 in uh, 2007. The I guess one thing I'm super curious about. I mean, as someone you've done a lot of historical analysis of the alt-right in the United States, and you've also done a lot of analysis of different societal issues impacting United States, maybe North America more generally. What do you think of the current situation and what's been happening in the United States? I guess we're recording this in the summer of 2025, so and with under the second Trump presidency.
Yeah, that is. I think that if you can actually answer that, there's like a decent award, history award in there for you. But the main things that I have to say is like, as a historian, the things that I'm taking away are that there's a lot of narrative, especially in sort of a more liberal interpretation of current events, that treats this as some kind of novel breakdown, this sort of like new series of events. But if you have a historical memory that goes beyond, goes earlier than 2016, you can see the precedents of the moment that we're in that are way deeper in the sort of American experience and the sort of history of the United States and the last like century or so. Like, one of the things I always think is really interesting is that Donald Trump as a president seems to actually like he governs a lot. I like one of my friends, my former PhD supervisor. He is a historian of like late 19th century America, and it came out to me. He's like, this guy like he governs a lot like Teddy Roosevelt, and he is trying to, I think, channel that sort of late 19th century presidency, mostly because that was like just when like the presidency was not as powerful as it is today, but had a lot more. Was like diplomacy back then was a lot more like interpersonal rather than like large institutions with like deliberating and decision making bodies and stuff. But I think that like, so you could like see it on the long scale of American history. If you want like the 150-year story, it is a explicit moving away from the United States as sort of a modern, organized, like bureaucratic state. Like, you can see the sort of trend line in the United States in the last like century of it joining the rest of the countries in the world and becoming more strengthening institutions and becoming like stronger bureaucratic states that have like services and welfare and like all sorts of like just the things that a lot of modern countries have, and now that we take for granted. And now a explicit attempt to move away from that to something that honestly, and on top of like kind of putting aside great power politics and moving towards like, instead of like a sort of American post-Cold War hegemony, moving towards a multipolar global situation, a lot of it feels like we're moving towards a like new Victorian age and all of the horrors that entails. So that's like the really, really like longue durée version of it, is that we're kind of moving into a new global norm that really hasn't existed since basically since the First World War. And that means that like we're coming out of like a long period where like there were rules to the international order. There were like you weren't allowed like after World War I, we made a whole bunch of like ground rules for the world about how you can declare how war can be played out, how diplomacy is to be done, that like things have to be done on the global stage, and like that seems to be dissolving rather fast. The other one is that Donald Trump also represents the sort of end of a long history of the last crisis of capitalism and the response to it. So there was a time that's not very different from how things are now, which was in the 1920s, where there was like extreme wealth inequality, but nothing close to what we have today. And then there was the great market crash of 1929 and the depression of the 1930s, which was then responded to by following economic wisdom that paired out really well, which was, Keynesian economics, because basically to be an alternative to, Soviet-style communism, they decided to adopt a little bit of planned economy, and they added like a bunch of stuff where they would use the state's power to invigorate the economy a little bit, and then kind of still keep the market system, but keep it within bounds. And that has also been a lot of like the sort of Western world's, state. Like some countries, to more or less degrees, have free markets that are then constrained by welfare states, by taxation, like progressive taxation, and programs meant to blunt the sort of brutal edge of this system that's designed to, at its core, funnel money away from people and then shove it to like the hands of a few people. And I think that a lot of Americans lost the plot and realized that this was a explicit post-World War II, almost like bargain made with workers. Like, you won't become communists, and we will let you unionize, have reduce income inequality, give good jobs, create good housing, that kind of thing, if you're white. And then that kind of bargain was what kept American stability in the mid-century. And you can trace almost perfectly the dissolution of American stability and the beginning of it sort of falling apart and leading towards today to the sort of right-wing attempt to dismantle that system. So you might have the first example of that might have been the Barry Goldwater campaign in 1964, where Barry Goldwater was a Republican candidate for president who had some very, very extreme right-wing views and was considered by the American people crazy. And Lyndon B. Johnson won with one of the largest majorities in American history. And the Republican presidents, the only Republican president after that was Nixon. And Nixon was very much a kind of conservative, but still fairly liberal. There's this sort of term that were called Rockefeller Republicans, because the Republican Party was a lot more they were a lot more liberal, and they had a sort of more conscientious, social justice forward idea towards it in it. And then with Reagan, the sort of that sort of part of the party got explicitly exiled, and the Democratic Party, because of their loss in 1984, on a sort of trying to really push a worker-focused, labor-focused, their bread and butter that had worked for them since FDR, they pushed that and they lost badly. And the lesson they learned is that basically they needed to jettison organized labor, they needed to jettison the sort of working class roots of the party, and you had what were called third wave or new wave Democrats. The probably most explicit version of this would be Bill Clinton's presidency in the 1990s. And this was the Democratic Party explicitly moving away from populist left-wing economics and moving towards finance and technology with a slightly socially progressive bent to it, although not always. And that became the sort of status quo. Things would have gotten a lot worse if it wasn't for the fact that the internet was invented around that time and caused a huge economic boom that sort of balanced it out. But during the Reagan administration and the following Clinton, or the Bush and then Clinton administration, you saw this period of strong deregulation of the finance sector, deregulation of the economy, and a move towards more and more free market economics. The general keyword to use here is neoliberalism. The ideology of neoliberalism basically became bipartisan consensus after the Cold War, which is this idea that basically free markets are superior to the government in every possible way, and if you can find a way to replace a function of the state with a function of the free market, then do it. And that has been continuously happening. And the more, for example, one of the bills that Bill Clinton put in place was an explicit repeal of something called the Glass-Steagall Act, And the Glass-Steagall Act was a bill put in by FDR during the Depression, which meant that, like, if you were the kind of bank that held people's bank accounts, a bank, or if you were an investment bank, those could not be the same company. So, like, a bank that made its money by investing in the stock market couldn't then also be the same kind of bank that held your money. So, so what happened was that basically banks were now able to invest in the stock market with people's life savings, because they were like, well, we have protections enough in place and everything is going so well that we're never going to have a bank, foreclose like it did in 1929 or 1930, where like a bank goes out of business and all of a sudden tons of people who had bank accounts there all of a sudden have no money. Because keeping trust in that institution is like key to like preserving faith in sort of economic system that keeps everything up. Anyways, I know I'm rambling, so I have to say, like, what happened is that as that kept getting dismantled, it led to more and more volatility in the economy, because capitalism by its very nature is a system that is prone to booms and crashes unless it is very strictly managed. And so you had the 2008 crash because a deregulated banking system was able to leverage toxic assets and then trade them around, which led to a whole lot of money that basically didn't exist in the economy pretending to be there. And ever since 2008, the entire economy has been held up by basically keeping interest rates unsustainably low. So everybody could borrow money infinite, especially like companies could borrow money virtually infinitely and burn through it with the hope that they could, become the monopoly, for example, Uber spending tons and tons of money to take over an entire industry and then jack up the prices once they have a monopoly, that kind of thing. But that plus like the disruptions caused by COVID and all that kind of stuff has led to the economy getting more and more unstable, which has led to more and more people being disillusioned with the capitalist system. But because, and this has to do, I think, a lot with the fact that the Democratic Party, and this is going to sound kind of quixotic, but when it comes to their the primaries and caucus system for when they're choosing their presidential candidates, the Republican Party is actually a lot more democratic in its, like, the people have more say over their primaries and caucuses than the Democratic Party does. And so when people realized that the sort of capitalist status quo wasn't working, the Republican Party's candidate that called that out, even though he was, lying through his teeth because he's the face of everything that's wrong with what's happening, but because, it's not exactly a party made up of people with good critical thinking skills, and because, he was able to channel that resentment that they really didn't have a name for, so they were blaming basically, people of color or LGBT people or whoever they wanted to blame. But he was able to leverage that sort of knowledge that everyone has that the way things are isn't going to work, and he leveraged it to power. And I think he would have been reelected in 2020 if it wasn't for his explicitly bad handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I really think that we're going to look back and see like the Biden administration kind of as like almost like a little blip or a mistake or something like that. Like it broke down over one specific weird thing. And in the Democratic Party, you had the exact same kind of anti-establishment, things are messed up, we need to do something, which was Bernie Sanders, who sort of inherited the Occupy Wall Street energy. And the Democratic Party pulled all of the stops imaginable to basically kill that insurgent campaign. And so while in 2016 and 2020, so the Democratic Party was making themselves basically the face of the economic status quo that wasn't serving anybody anymore by actively getting rid of the major voices of reform from within the party. Because the Democratic Party is not like in a sort of like not in the way that like Americans would conceive of it, but like they're a conservative party, and that they don't like change, and that they have like they believe very much in like seniority and like keeping leadership, like they believe very strongly in their own institutions, and they don't like seeing those get upended. They get very upset. While the Republican Party is a lot more ideological, and so Trump overthrowing basically the party, a lot of the people in that party were able to like, okay, I guess this is what we're doing now, and then they kind of just went along with it. So All that is to say is like you saw this, like there's this greater thing where like the sort of 20th century world order that was like a growing international rules-based world order is falling apart. Then the crisis of capitalism that kind of that started in the Depression, that then had a bunch of programs made to remediate all of the issues that they caused, then had those systematically dismantled over a period of like 4 or 5 decades. And then once you've done that, you then end up with a president who is basically like the representation of all of the rage against the system, but with none of the right targets by somebody who was just blatantly lying about what is all the problems. And you could say some other stuff like how the civil rights movement and the sort of like student activist protest era created a sort of norm around social justice and the progress of social justice that always had a growing resentment building in the reactionary right that has also been spending the last like 40 years dismantling all of the things that they fought for and putting themselves back in power, which is all basically like we're kind of seeing the backlash basically against desegregation essentially. Or just even a backlash against the Obama years and the sort of slight amount of social progress made with like Me Too and like Black Lives Matter and all that. So it's like a lot that you could play around with, but like in many ways, it's just a lot of the cycles. There's this, I think it was like Octavia Butler that said that like you can always guess what the crises of the future are going to be, because all you need to do is look at what the problems around you are right now that everyone are ignoring, and then give them 30 years until they become crises. And we are basically reaping the effects of pretty much everybody who had the power to do so, neglecting all of the things that they had put in place to prevent a crisis from happening after World War II, thinking that those were in the past. And now everyone's chickening on the roost in like the worst way possible. And now all of the worst off people are going to pay for the consequences, or got to pay the consequences for what, the wealthy in both political parties have basically set up for us.
Yeah.
So that was a really, really long answer.
No, but this makes total sense. It's a very helpful overview. It's a very helpful summary of what's going on the societal, like economic level at the big picture, and then how that's influencing the party. I have a question that is about all this, but it's on this. It's another angle that I know you also have studied. I wanted to ask about how has all. Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to do something a little funky. I'm going to ask 3 questions that are a bit different, and then kind of let you weave them in. But they're kind of 3 distinct questions I was thinking about with what you're saying. But the first is how has all of this that you've been talking about, all these different economic changes, neoliberalism and all this stuff, how has it impacted like regular people on like a regular level in the United States? So like your average person, or more average person is probably the wrong way to phrase that, but regular person. And then the other question, you were talking about like the Democratic Party became a party of basically promoting the establishment that no one liked. But then the Republican Party kind of became we're going to promote this type of way of answering it. And you were giving kind of a high level overview of that. I guess my question is, why did the Republican answer, say under Donald Trump, become compelling to the many regular people for whom it's become compelling to? Why does that seem like a compelling answer for some? And then the third question is a bit different. It was just something I was thinking about with what you were saying. You were saying that the problems people ignore that everyone ignores in society becomes a crisis in 30 years. And I was going to ask you, what do you think are the problems we're ignoring now that you think might be a crisis in 30 years?
Sure. Okay. Crises now. So what was the second one again? I got the first and the last one.
Why is Trump's answer to the answer proposed that Trump proposed, or the ways of blaming, the people's problems, why is that, like, why do people believe that? Like, why has that become something that at least significant people on the right have bought into?
Yeah. Okay. To kind of get into the first thing is, like, if you were to talk about the neoliberal turn, which, like, basically, like, so neoliberalism is like the longer term for it is neoclassical liberalism. So if you think about, like, the way that capitalism developed in the early industrial revolution, you had basically a completely deregulated economy, because, like, governments, like the idea that governments would even, like, that their job was even to do anything with the economy wasn't really, like, a thing in, like, the 1800s. Like, that is a 20th century, like, kind of project. Now, when that changed, because when left to its own devices, it led to a huge economic crash that led the world into crisis for decades. And it led to a working class that was so oppressed and in such dire straits that communist revolutions were propping up all over the world, and even in the United States. If you look at, like, America's like deregulated economy, you can see that, like, the U.S.'s labor history in, like, the 19th century is, like, extremely violent and, like, bloody and stuff, and people don't, that kind of history doesn't really get a lot through. But so a lot of like the sort of Keynesian, like, FDR type programs were meant to try and stop that crisis, and government sort of getting in. But the thing is that business owners have never liked it, because it means, like, increased taxes, decreased profit. And if you look at, like, history through, like, a historical materialist thing, like, those who have money are going to try to use their money to make money, and whether that means building a business, but it can also mean lobbying and changing of politics to fit their needs. And they were able to find all the cracks and really change things, including, like, intentionally, like, building consciousness. This sort of happened in, like, the 1970s. The reason being because there was always going to be a little bit of an economic humbling when the U.S. went from producing almost half of all goods on Earth at the end of World War II to the ascension of other markets and other economies happening in the 1970s and the 1980s, 1990s, as, like, more countries start to develop and go through their own revolutions in one way or another. So what that resulted in is, as labor started to lose power, as the economy became more and more deregulated, you can see on, like, a chart, like, from the 1970s onward, an increasing in income inequality, an increasing in productivity that doesn't mix with that doesn't coincide with an increase in wages, because wages have basically stayed flat for decades, with inflation effectively taking it down, and the wealth of, like, a smaller group of people getting bigger and bigger. And what that's resulted in is, like, look at the difference between the generations over time. Like, the boomers grew up in that time where, like, America produced, like, a vast majority of goods on Earth, and their time going through jobs was relatively easy because there were lots of jobs, they were high paying, they had good benefits, and they were able to, they didn't have to struggle as much economically. And then the Gen Xers had a little bit more of that problem as they grew up in the 1980s, and they had more of that deregulation, but not as much, so they still landed on their feet. Millennials then had, like, the 2008 crash sort of completely mess us up. And, like, even today, like, Zoomers have, like, basically, they live in, like, the full, like, American gladiators, everyone for themselves mentality that is sort of just typifies today's life. So you can, like, chart through time as the economy becomes more deregulated. Even the more it grows and becomes more powerful, the average person isn't reaping that benefit. So, like, basically, you can see since the, like, 1970s, the U.S. economy growing and growing and growing, but the share of it going to the majority of people shrinking. And so while everything is getting better, everyone's lives are either stagnating or slightly getting worse. And without noticing that it is the fact that the reason why nobody has money is because we have made it possible for a few people to take most of it. They then blame things like, for example, like in Appalachia, if people had believed stronger in government regulations and trying to make the economy work for people, the closing down of coal mines, which would have happened anyway because of environment, but also because coal is just not a profitable power source, they would have found a way to have those people lay on their feet. But without that, they instead just kind of let these communities decay, and the people who live in that don't see the market forces that are causing their communities to decay because of people taking more money for themselves and nobody helping them. They see environment causing job loss, and so their enemy then becomes the environment. You see media reports of illegal immigration, and you then your job becomes more precarious around the same time. And instead of blaming the fact that first of all that the business class is exploiting those illegal immigrants by using the fact that they don't have labor rights to pay them literally criminal wages, two, the fact that that on a net that these immigrants actually make more jobs than they take, but that mentality that doesn't get through, and so they instead of blaming the fact that we have more and more billionaires, they would blame immigrants, and that sort of scapegoating becomes this is kind of dovetailing into why Trump was so successful, because it was beneficial to both political parties because basically the Republicans who actively think that this is good would push this and would use the scapegoating in order to get votes. And Democrats basically got into a weird political strategic position where they either agree with this or they think that pushing back against it would cost them elections. So they kind of were either not pushing back against these myths hard enough, or they were actively in support of them, which means that, for example, the reason why Trump can blame immigrants and allow for basically an ethnic cleansing campaign of the United States that's happening right now is because everybody who had the power to do so spent the last 40 years making everybody afraid of immigrants. And that was even a bigger case. That took decades. But for example, the backlash against transgender people, that one is not even hard to see because that is literally a moral panic that they brought up 6 years ago. And you could see the sort of freak out happen very quickly because they've been able to just take the situation we live in and throw all of these outrage things at a certain segment of the American population. And because they don't because of how America is so married to the idea of the free market and that anybody can make it and be rich, this is a more palatable person to go after than say it's struggling with the long history of white supremacy and the long history of economic inequality, and you have to be to really understand how the world works, you have to read 3 books by a person who's been dead since the 19th century and is a total of over 3,000 pages. It's not exactly a thing that a person who is not literally overeducated to the point of insanity is going to really be able to articulate. And we've been spending the last few decades also actively talking about how doing anything about this is communism, and that communism is a thing that they have there's an active discouragement of political education in America, so they don't know what communism is. They think communism is when a thing is bad, or socialism, or even just left-wing economics. Basically, America headed towards a crisis, and every single viable path out that didn't end in disaster has had literally over half a century at this point dedicated to shutting down in everybody's minds those as possibilities. And that has caused a lot of the, I think it's the reason why a Trump can resonate so well, and why And I don't like to compare these people because there's like a certain type of liberal that tries to make this comparison in a different way. But it's why like a Trump can like resonate so strongly in America, but like a Sanders can't, or would need to do more work to do so. I actually think it will work because now we finally have a generation that did not grow up with the Cold War, and they seem a lot more amenable to these ideas. And I think that a lot of socialist ideas would be very popular if you just mentioned what they were and just didn't say the word socialist. But either way, and to kind of get into that idea of the crises of like today, like the big crisis of today is just that, well, the big one is that we're seeing the complete and utter breakdown of the way that the international system works, because it was all built around one country that basically is imploding. And we don't know what the other side of that's going to look like because it can mean a lot of different things. But I think that's a crisis that everybody knows is happening. The things that we're ignoring that are going to become much bigger crises the further down the line are, despite the fact that it's a crisis now, ignoring climate change and the issue with our carbon output, because we're still actively ignoring that, and that is going to be, we're going to be like, you know, paying dividends on that neglect in the decades to come. And just like the complete, like I think that one of the problems that will become a crisis, probably not in 30 years, probably in like, you know, a year, if not this year, especially when like the tariffs start to really bite in America, is maybe you'll remember this, but like when like last year around this time, we were having this discourse where like everyone was saying, man, the economy really sucks. Nobody has any money. It's impossible to get a job. Everything is super expensive. And then you would get these like finger wagging tisk articles in the New York Times that are like, well, actually, the stock market's doing great. So I don't know what you're complaining about. And that like, I feel like Donald Trump almost won on that alone. Like people were suffering, things were shitty. The you know, COVID-19 devastated so many businesses and so many people's livelihoods, and really just completely disentangled like what a normal cost of living is like for an average person. And then to have like one side be like, I'm listening to you, I hear you, and all of these people who don't look like you are the problem. And the other side being like, no, you are wrong, your experience is wrong, everything is fine. And which was the more compelling argument at that one, right? Like, and then of course, you know, they also ignored the ongoing genocide that's happening in Gaza, which has now become like probably one of the worst acts of mass violence to happen since World War II. And like, because they dismissed that as an election issue, and I think they still paid, maybe not as big as I think, but they definitely paid at the polls for that decision. And so like, I think like a lot of the things, like I think if you want to like be like, what are the crises of today that we're ignoring that are going to become even bigger problems tomorrow? Think about all of the things that the Democrats basically in the last election ignored that their base were pissed off about, and you have a pretty good laundry list of all of the things that are going to be problems.
Yeah, that's totally fair. This everything you said makes total sense. So maybe going back a little bit, what you're saying about people being like people experiencing hardship, but then basically blaming maybe undocumented immigrants because they're basically forced in a position where they can get, like you said, almost criminally low wages. Like it to me reminds me of like blaming the rain, not the clouds. It's like the rain is what you feel on your skin. That's the problem that you experience. But you gotta like look up a little bit to see like what's causing this, what's going on. I mean, it can be a very real thing, but it makes absolute sense what you're saying about there's just a lot more going on. And to me, that connects to some of the issues that you were talking about with crises, like we have global inequality. I mean, telling people things are good when they don't feel it's good, that's bad messaging. I interviewed someone before, my name is Kyle Morrison, who is more of an expert on the messaging side of things, and he said like that's just not fundamentally like listening to people is important and of not fundamentally listening to people, but also like the stock market being good is not the same as the economy doing well. Like, there are many instances where the US economy, by its official metrics of like overall metrics, are doing really well. Like GDP is going up, like those really big metrics, but inequality is getting worse. Many people's lives are getting harder, even if the total amount of wealth in the United States is going up. This very frequently happens. Yeah. What do you think about like um you were kind of talking about this in a like briefly in a part of what you were saying, but how do you think, as a person, as a content creator who does a lot of public discourse, right? You talk to people, to regular people, or make stuff for them. How have you found like unfortunately Donald Trump was very effective at getting support, even if it was for blaming things, kicking down, blaming people that were more vulnerable. What do you think the left can do? You were talking about this a little bit with Bernie Sanders, with maybe some of the messaging that might work when you were talking about why Bernie Sanders doesn't get the same following that, say, Donald Trump got. But yeah, what have you found in terms of messaging that works or doesn't work for actually helping people understand the issues and then trying to move towards something that might be actually effective in dealing with some of these fundamental issues, say like economic inequality?
Yeah, really good question. I think one that doesn't have it hasn't had an answer for a while, but there is the closest thing I've had to hope in an answer is kind of on the horizon right now. So, first of all, like, I think that we might be under. I first of all think that in many ways, just getting out of these messages way would have done well. Like if Bernie Sanders had not seen his candidacy get actively murdered by the Democratic Party, I think that could have resonated a lot more with the American people and could have tipped the balance. Like I think that like a lot of people, like I even think about, even though this man is probably like one of the dumbest human beings to have a platform, but like Joe Rogan had like was like a sort of like I think he speaks for a lot more of like what like a certain class of Americans think, with like the idea of like, yeah, like Bernie Sanders, and then they fucked him over, so I'm going with Trump, and like that. It's a thing that doesn't make sense if you're like an overeducated coastal elite or whatever. But for a lot of people, like Bernie Sanders, like he said, I don't know if this is true now, but for years and years and years, he was consistently pulled as the most popular politician in Congress, and like that still stuck. But it did seem like that it wasn't enough to break through the Democratic Party's institutions. And the thing is, and this is the way that I think I really need to think, is like you can't really, kind of like with like the study of capitalism, like you can't, there's no point in crying foul, right? Like because this isn't a game. And so even if things aren't fair, you have to find a way to win, even if things aren't fair. And that's just a fact. And so, honestly, I think that one of the most significant things that has happened this year to show what the future of politics, especially for the left, will be, is the New York City mayoral primary that happened earlier this year, like last month, I think, where a candidate that was a serial sexual harasser but had like there was somebody who was completely hated, but had full institutional support, had like literally outspent every other candidate combined, and had like used like every single dirty Democratic trick in the book to try and win, lost to a like Democratic socialist who's younger than I am, who has a Muslim sounding name. And the reason is both because I think that the second Trump election has really made a lot of people I think that there is like a now kind of growing discon. Basically, a lot of liberals are figuring out the things that the socialists were trying to tell them like 8 years ago. But on top of that, so I'm kind of dancing around. The person is Zohran Mamdani, and he has the mayoral election coming up, I think, this fall. But him winning that Democratic primary is enough to say what it is, which is just like he campaigned on, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could campaign on things like things that would make your life better? And the thing is that a lot of and I want to just like preface everything in this conversation is just in the American context, because that's what I'm an expert in American history and American cultural studies, so I can speak to the best. But like, I do think that this kind of thing could translate outside of the United States as well to different degrees. But like, he ran on, hey, let's fix your cost of living crisis. Let's make your the government actually can do things to make your life better. And in the past, that would be written off as either idealistic and naive, or it would have been just completely annihilated. Like, they were all ready to kill Mamdani's campaign because he was insufficiently loyal to Israel for the mayor of fucking New York City. And that was an absolutely insane thing to do, but I think that in the past that would have worked. But now they tried it and it didn't work. A lot of their typical techniques have been kind of shown for the absolute not for the deflections that they actually are. And if Mamdani does anything, is that it's a sign of what a future of left-wing politics could be like, because the sort of third way liberal centrist platforming of the sort of 1990s, the sort of the Bill Clinton generation, because of how the Democratic Party politics works, those same people who almost 40 years ago were dictating policy are still in charge. The party's run by Nancy Pelosi, a woman who's in her 80s, and Chuck Schumer, who's also, I think, in his 80s, and the last president to run was also in his 80s, and so all those people, they were people who came into power during the 1990s, and they were the people who brought in this abandonment of labor. And if this younger generation of new politicians can sort of upend their seats of power, if say some of the rumblings about, I think in 2028, I want to say, there's talk of Ocasio-Cortez making a run for Chuck Schumer's Senate seat, or something like a new speaker or minority speaker, depending upon how the next midterms go, to replace Nancy Pelosi, or any of those things. There are some candidates like Mamdani, but also I think of in Illinois, there's a candidate by the name of Kat Abelazela, I think is her full name. And she's also kind of doing the exact same thing that Mamdani's doing. I think that if more people do that kind of stuff, that is again, these are ideas that have been polling for years to be overwhelmingly popular ideas. You just have to actually, a lot of times the Democratic Party would act as if it was some kind of insult, as if it was as if it was an affront to their dignity to have to campaign on doing things to improve people's lives. And the people are realizing that actually, if you campaign, Trump did it by just lying. He just said, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to give you that, and vote for me. And then they did. But if you back it up with actual policies of hey, we're going to put in this program, we're going to do this program and all that, that is a thing that is really popular and people vote for. And I think that if there's a path forward for overall left-wing politics, it's going to be kind of Mamdani style politics. For content creators, my whole thing, my goal has always been to be a teacher, because I do think that a lot of the issues of, if there's a major issue that the left wing has, And I'm not going to, and this isn't going to be like it got too woke or it got too IDPol or whatever. The real problem that the left has is that it has a uphill battle against a Western culture that has been spent decades steeped in anti-left propaganda. So there's a lot of lies about left-wing positions that need to be addressed. But two, just a lack of education about these topics. Not that people I don't want to get into like this isn't to like talk down to people, but what it is to say is that left-wing politics since about the 1960s, because of the active attempt to get the left out of mainstream politics, has been secluded to people like me, overeducated, pencil heads or whatever you want to call it, right? People who have way too many letters after their name, people who go to fancy schools and live on it's become kind of an elitist thing because it got segmented into basically like the student activist movement. But what you need if you want to build a left-wing movement is you need to have a working class left-wing movement, which means that you have to have left-wing ideas like making people's lives better and, but you have to have them make sense to the average person who doesn't have has a life and doesn't want to read Capital volumes 1, 2, and 3 in order to understand how the world works. And on top of that, realize that this doesn't have to be an overly academic thing. It's a real left-wing politics is meat and potatoes and literally meat and potatoes and rent and electricity and stuff, because it's based in materialism and things as how they are rather than a sort of ideal idea of how things should be. And so I think that there's something very compelling in that. No nonsense about it if you actually do it. But my whole goal has been always to democratize a political education and to understand the world as it actually is in ways that are entertaining, hopefully, and interesting, and give people the sort of tools that they have to either develop their own ideas or to engage in political conversations that are less about talking about superstructure and base or talking about historical materialism, and instead talking about man, doesn't it suck that if you're renting a place, there's just a dude who makes money from takes a lot of your money and does nothing? Doesn't that suck? That kind of stuff.
What I definitely agree with what you're saying about maybe looking to him for success and looking to him for or looking at how to speak to lower class people to talk about, okay, this is what we need to do to make your life better. What do you think that might look like? I mean, the two examples my mind goes to, you already gave one, which is the mayor candidate. Maybe the other example might be FDR, because of course he was a major person that got a very big following by, and maybe, maybe on the one end you kind of want to return to the New Deal, maybe, but maybe the New Deal is not really the best way to do it now. Yeah, what are your thoughts? What kind of things do you think would be the right things in your experience to talk about, to be this is what to kind of win over people who are, yeah, we'll say working class people or really service sector people too, who are looking at their life prospects get worse. Looking at inflation, looking at the cost of things, looking at their wages and saying, I'm less able to do stuff now, I'm stuck or whatever, the various issues that they see.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I would say is that the service sector and the working class are the same thing. The thing is, America is a service economy, and so its working class is not factory workers as much as it is when people say that oh, we're losing the working class vote, the white steel workers, and it's no, man, the working class vote is the barista with the purple hair. That is, or the Hispanic taxi driver, that is the working class. Right. But anyways, that's a sense of fact.
It just for the record, that's exactly what I was kind of hinting at. I think a lot of politicians, when they focus on quote unquote the working class, they focus on manufacturing jobs, despite the fact that the service sector is, those technically do exist still in the U.S., but the service sector is the vast majority of the working class. Yeah, but keep going. Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, we should, kind of in that vein too, like when like Trump was talking about bringing back industrial jobs, and even like I think this is one of the things I think Bernie missed the mark on when talking about bringing back manufacturing. It's like what people don't want is manufacturing. Like manufacturing is not good work. Like the reason why we have a service economy is because, and why so many people got educated is because many parents who destroyed their bodies doing industrial work fought like hell to get their kids an education so that their kids would be safe in an office, not wrecking their limbs and like really doing the backbreaking labor that industrialization does. Like in the ideal world, if we had like the robots to do it, no one would do manufacturing work because it is terrible work. It is dangerous. It is uncomfortable, and it destroys the bodies of people who do it. But either way, that is besides the fact. The thing that we need is like I think that there's something emblematic in what you said, and I don't want you to take this as a criticism, but I think that it's a very telling thing because I had this as well, and that is like you're talking like how do we talk to people about these ideas to get them on board? And what I think is that the idea is that it can't be like we can't think of it like we have the ideas that we need to like properly convey. It's just like there's this really great, I think that Americans especially, but like everybody, but especially Americans don't like, or they get very on edge when like they feel like they're being talked down to. And I think that like the big thing is not even that, like it's like I make educational videos because they're out on the internet. You can choose to watch them. You can choose to not watch them. I hope to make them entertaining because I think that everybody is naturally curious and that everybody, if given the opportunity, can watch a YouTube video and have a good time and learn something and feel good about learning something. And honestly, I think that the way to have a proper like left-wing movement is not to properly convey all of these ideas, but to have these people engage and like basically give them the access that they have been deprived to these ideas so that they can build the movement themselves. Mm-hmm. Like the working class people, we need to like, I'm trying to find a way so that somebody who puts in a like 12-hour shift comes home and is exhausted and is not going to fucking crack open a book, is not going to crack open like mutual aid to ponder over an essay in their 3 hours they have between when they get home and when they crash. And I want to make something that will make it so that they can get this wealth of information about how the world works that they have been deprived of, and there's been active works to deprive them of this information, and give it to them, because when they do, they'll realize why things are as bad as they are, and it's not just because that's the way the world works or because of personal failings, but it's because there's literally a very small group of people who have made it their business to make sure that you are not made aware of these things. And that is and it's because they have all of the structures of the economy are designed to serve them. And that sounds more conspiratorial than it actually is. It's kind of more like a force of nature. Like we live in an economy where private institutions made up of multiple people with levels of bureaucracy and everything like that are designed with the purpose of maximizing profit. And in doing so, like how water will get into all the cracks in stone to break it, they will find every possible way to maximize profits by either reducing costs or raising profit margins, which means prison labor, which means racism and sexism and homophobia, in order to create classes that can be exploited even more, because that no matter what laws and stuff you put in place, laws can also be influenced. And so it's just it's almost like a gravity. It's the way that the economy's fundamental function processes. And until the economy doesn't work like that, we're always going to be fighting this thing. That's just the way it works. It's almost like a force of nature. So I'm not even gonna be the world would be better if we just took Elon Musk and Warren Buffett and Mark Zuckerberg, and we just stripped them of all of their assets and distributed them amongst everybody, because we would just recreate the same system over again. It would just be somebody else down the line, because that's just the way this economic system goes. It always drifts towards this sort of point of crisis. You can reset the clock, but it's sort of like, at the end of the day, it's a device that I also came from a background in like cybernetics and technology history. It is
which is amazing.
System.
I do a lot with cybernetics too. Keep going.
Lovely. Yeah. So it's like capitalism is a cybernetic system of people and institutions and ideas and processes that is designed to do this one thing. And there's no amount of regulation that it can't just figure out how to get around. And there's no, kind of like when we're talking about today with like AI alignment stuff, like we're kind of like thinking like, how do we find all these ways to get this machine that can solve any problem to make things that it can't fix? Like, how do we make a machine, like, how can we get a machine to do the thing we want it to do when it is designed to do something else? And it's like that's the sort of I had a friend who was like a liberal undergrad that I talked with this once. It was like, us trying to regulate capitalism and make it better is almost like trying to take a drilling machine and teach it how to fly. And people are like, well, if you take the engine and you put a propeller on it and you attach wings to it, it will work. Like, it could fly for a little bit, but it's like, yeah, but it's not going to work really well. It's going to crash and it's going to start drilling, because that's what drills are for. When like you could just build an airplane, which is a completely different type of machine, but it will do the thing that you actually want it to do. So that's the whole thing to say that communism is good. And the other part too is that is more, in line with the actual thing that you asked me, instead of just me ranting, was that I think that like these are the things that I just want people to know about, and I don't want to. I think that, I do so because I don't think you should have to pay $20,000-$30,000 to have a basic education in how the world works. I think that people have been deprived of this education, and that if they knew about how the world actually worked, they would think politically very different than they do today.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I absolutely see what you're saying. So, maybe one quick thing on the criticism you said. For me, it makes total sense. The way I was phrasing it implicitly separated. And you're exactly right. It implicitly separated me from the people who are experiencing the hardship, which is, one, not true. Capitalism affects all of us, but also, more importantly, I think that's emblematic of how a lot of the conversation goes. Kind of like what you're hinting at the end, that people get that there's this kind of separation, and and that relates to like the differences in education and stuff like this. I see a huge advantage.
I don't want to like call you out on that too, because that is a mentality that even I get stuck in. And everybody who is overeducated, like everyone who's educated, everyone who does this ends up in this kind of situation. And I think that it is because we have, like you and like we have, like we were both born in the 80s, right? So like we grew up entirely in a world where like the people who are talking about these kinds of things are in these like isolated, educated spaces. When like, for example, when you're talking about like FDR and how he put in the New Deal and how that got its like widespread support, well, that's because he came about in a day where like these kinds of ideas were actually being talked about on like factory floors by like regular people.
Right.
Like, so like the problem is that aspect has been stolen from those people. Those people have been robbed of the sort of intellectual discourse that they would engage with, that they would be able to build movements off of, because they know that giving people that kind of education is dangerous to, the way things are.
Right. This makes total sense. And one quick side, but I was born in the year 1990. So I am 1 year from being born in the 80s. So, oh man, totally different there. But yes, yeah, exactly what you're saying makes total sense. I think one advantage in you are talking you mentioned this, but one huge advantage to content creation is that, or being a content creator, is that you don't have to talk about alternatives. You don't have to talk. So like, I think one problem that I'll see politicians fall into, say X politician is running for office, and like you can say, these are big problems. Isn't this frustrating? And they might say, yeah, these are big problems. Isn't this frustrating? Inequality, inflation, yada, yada, yada. But then they almost feel compelled to then say, but now here is my 5-point plan that's going to solve these problems. And then suddenly that creates this, now they have to advocate that plan. And that can create this sense that can, I think, lead to a bit of a, now I have the idea, that can lead to this sense of one form of that superiority that we're talking about, that now separates them from, that creates a them, that the politician is now separate and saying, this, my idea is the right idea. Whereas I think with content creation, you have more ability to sit with people and say, here's the frustration, let's talk about this together and let the plan come about. And that to me just fundamentally seems like a healthier way to approach it. I think politicians should approach it that way. They often get kind of sucked into approaching it the other way. But like, because it's a bit more of a, this is frustrating, I share in the frustration, and we're all in this together, and it involves more of a listening to figure out what the solution is and staying in that ambiguity longer, rather than having to say, here's a solution, and then coming up with something that is usually not really a perfect solution. It usually amounts to trying to continue to give more gasoline, into the oil rig. Sorry, I messed up that metaphor. To put more gasoline into the drill to keep it flying longer. I think I'm using your metaphor right, but like, it's like to continue it to try to keep it in the air a little longer. And it's like I think your style leads to a more effective holistic solution. Or what do you think? I mean, maybe after doing it for so long, you're like, there's whole other sets of problems, and it's annoying in other ways, and what I just said is incredibly naive.
No, I do think that as I actually do, like, I'm under the I think that there's a lot of different solutions to problems that are local to the places that they're in. Like, for example, right. I don't think that Zohran Mamdani's like his proposed things for New York are necessarily what like Sheboygan is going to need to fix their problems. But on top of that, like, I do like, there is something useful in showing what kind of models work and what kind of ideas are even possible. Because, like, for example, like, my partner worked in the government for a long time, and like, under a liberal government was still being pushed, like, all the solutions that you do have to have public-private partnerships. They have to be market-based solutions. And that is like the driving ideology of the state, which means that like, when people kind of get into institutions, they then are like, they'll kind of come under the impression that like, the ideas, the solutions that conform to the ruling neoliberal ideology are the ones that are like, that's just like they'll kind of position it as like, that's the sensible solution. That's the grown up solution. There's a lot of this, like where like, the person who I despise this man with all of my heart, Ezra Klein, who kind of tries to position like, these problems are too complicated for you average people to understand. And that's why we need like these really complicated solutions that are very market-based and all these things. And you don't have, you as like, as an average person has no input on this, because I'm the smarty pants who made Fox News that literally has the tagline explaining the news as if you are like a baby that needs to be spoon-fed ideas. And I do think that like, there's a much stronger way to approach this, which is, we all do suffer from the same problems, and getting people right and pissed about that is a good idea, because right now we need to be doing a lot of destroying of these power structures in order to put in new ones, if we even want to attempt things. But on top of that, like, we have like we do have ideas for proposed solutions, but it's not necessary that they're all going to work. We need to experiment. And the thing is that we have been so limited in what kind of tools we can use to fix different problems for decades, that we haven't even realized that there are tons of solutions that exist that we were like almost ideologically incapable of even engaging with. Like, for example, like, I keep going back to Mamdani, but I'm just like wowed by one of his proposals is to make, and if you live in New York, you could probably think it's like a big deal, but like government-run grocery stores that would be like price setting, right? Like that would be like able to like, because they're under the government, they don't have to, like, they can do things like put a grocery store right in the middle of a food desert. They can make it so that, like, nutritionally like viable foods will just be there. And like in neighborhoods that where the only grocery store is a bodega. And like, because I lived in Toronto, so we had a little bit of this kind of problem too. But like what like that proposed solution would have been completely unthinkable by any politician who's like mainstream today, because the only thing that they could possibly do would be to give it so that a business would have an incentive tax break and maybe a little bit of a subsidy if they built in a disadvantaged area, which would mean that like you'd be paying companies to run at a loss when they could just not go there and go somewhere more profitable, because they're just profit maximizing seeking behaviors. And so like, even just opening up like the possible range of solutions that exist, and on top of just like areas to explore, would be a big deal. So yeah, like but again, like I think we're still at the point of the argument of just getting people on board with agreeing that there is a problem and that the problem is the same problem that we're all thinking.
Yeah, yeah, this makes total sense. I have found that that good solutions are explainable to everyone. People can understand good solutions. If your solution is too technical that you need to say, you're not going to get it, but this is what they say, or I as an expert say this, or the experts I talked to said this, one or the other. Well, you're the expert, or you're citing some third party that's the expert. If you have to do that to justify your solution, you have usually one of two problems. You're not being creative and effective in how you're communicating, because you don't actually need to do that. You can communicate to them in their world really effectively, and you're just not doing it well. Or if it actually is a situation where you can't, it's because it's probably not a good solution. And one weird example of that, this is like a totally different like scope and aspect of life, but like I've been a data scientist for many years, and so like I built machine learning models, and these things are very technical. Like if I wanted to, so machine learning is really cool. The math of it gets a little bit complicated. I find it fascinating. Any viewer, you should look into this stuff. It is really cool, but it can get technical. But like when I'm presenting, so someone say I'm building a machine learning model as like a research project to try to understand something. Someone comes to me and they say, we have this problem. We want to learn about this. And if I'm building a model to help understand that, if the model is effective, it's because it gives insights that work on their level. And I'll see a lot of data scientists come and be like, they like think they have to explain in the abstract the entire mathematics of the system to somebody who doesn't have that type of background. And that's just not effective. That's not effective communication. That's not what they need. What they need is, here's your problem. here's what I learned about your problem, and then here's how I approach the project, and then here are the insights that help you along with your problem. And in my experience with these big societal issues with regular people, if your solution is an effective solution, if your solution is an effective economic solution, you could communicate that in that way. Like, here's the problem. We're seeing things become more expensive, or blah, yada, yada, whatever it is, such things that are very tangible to them. And then say, this is what I did, or this is how I thought about it in a way that makes sense to them in their world. This is what I did, and this is how this solution will be effective. Like, there can be types of science that get technical. Like, if this will address climate change, and maybe some of the details of how might get a little lost with the details of that science, that's fine. But you can still communicate it in a way that makes sense to their world. This was something I was thinking about with what you were saying. Like, with maybe the pick on, because you picked on Ezra Klein for this, but like, to that kind of, I consider that like a type of technocratic approach of like, you have to support the technocrats. That type of messaging, in my experience, usually amounts to power. Then that's the only way to actually phrase it and communicate it. It's usually about, we should give these people power because they have the technical knowledge, and not effective communication. Or yeah, what are your thoughts?
That makes sense. Like, yeah, my whole thing is that I never liked how Ezra Klein talks down to people. But yeah, like, your example of machine learning is great, because it's like, you don't need to teach somebody how to do matrix multiplication to show them that, like, it's a thing that finds patterns. But and like, also, I don't think that, if you can't explain I don't know, like super solids or something like that, then like, you're just not communicating well enough. Like, I can see that there are things that are genuinely complex that like don't have that thing, but to kind of get it on point, it's just that like, I don't think that it's like, this has not been communicated right. Or, I mean, oftentimes there is that, but the fact is, like, the average person can actually understand quite a lot more than people think they can.
Right.
They have been deprived of a lot of the sort of tools to understand complicated things, but they can understand these things. Like, people aren't dumb, and I think that, like, that's one of the things, like, one of the hurdles we really have to unlearn, because I do think that, like, I'm not an anti-intellectual in like in that sense, but like, I guess that's not what I'm saying, but I do think that, like, intellectual pursuits are something that everybody should be able to indulge in, not just those who are well off enough that they can go to fancy schools. I think that's the part, like, that I want. Like, I think about how I think it was like a Noam Chomsky interview that I heard about this, but like, the idea that, like, there was a time not long ago when, like, people who were like working in factories would do stuff like pay a kid to read like works of like philosophy and stuff like that on the floor, so that they could just listen along while they worked, because that kind of stuff was interesting, and like, that was the, like, even in its most, like, like, in a really skeezy, being ruined by grifters way, like, a lot of the, like, the manosphere influencers, if you like listen to the language that they try to use to explain their own nonsense, they try to talk about it in the context of intellectual pursuits. Like, I do think that, on average, most people are interested in that kind of stuff. I actually do.
Yeah, this makes total sense. Yeah, I don't get the sense that you're anti-intellectual at all. I do get a bit, in this, I mean this in a positive way, I do get the sense that you're a bit almost anti-elitist. You're you need a stamp of paper to say that you engage with this stuff. To me, it's about talking to people with where they're at. Yeah, how have you approached that as somebody who creates content?
In my sense, luckily I'm in a field that is literally about the human experience and the humanities and stuff. Like, I don't, to kind of go back to the thing, I don't know how I would teach matrix multiplication in a way that would make things make sense. But I do know that in my field that people resonate with stories. People resonate with apply like there are a lot of universal experiences that you can tie things to attach things that might seem abstract or far off to their lives, their experiences, their feelings. And as long as you get, like, my main way that I've been trying to connect is to, one, if there is an idea that hasn't been explained, because you'd have to read this, and this to try and unpack that and not leave anybody behind on that. And on top of that, just to try to make as many connections between the things that I'm talking about and their own lived experience that I can. And in my mind, like, people don't like being convinced. They don't like being like that. You're like, they like it when you're trying to like actively make a point at them. But if you just know enough to give to give the connections, to give the tools, and give them basically the material to think about and chew on their own to come to their own conclusions, that is enough. That is the way to do it.
Yeah, this makes total sense. I'm going to ask one final question. I guess speaking of about
Sure.
like, say you have a listener, whether they're college educated, wherever they're at in life, doesn't really matter, but they're curious and they want to learn more about some of the stuff that you've been talking about. Obviously, maybe other than your YouTube channel, as an obvious answer, where would you recommend they go for something practical to try to kind of understand about some of the big dynamics in the United States you've been talking about?
Oh boy. Okay, so let's see. I think I have it around here somewhere.
Oh,
So
perfect.
the unfortunate thing is that if you want to understand how the world works, you kind of have to read this. This is Capital by Karl Marx. This is part one of a 3-book series, and as you can see, it is extremely long. Don't read this.
Yeah.
Don't read this. Unless you hate yourself and want to intellectually torture yourself with actual math and stuff like that. Don't read that. I think that the best book that I recommend to people on, like, if you want like the beginning of how to understand it, is David Harvey is the author. And David Harvey is he's a professor who he teaches the course. He teaches the entire course you have to take just to understand this book at his school. And he has written a book called, let me just find it for you, because I read it a long time ago. I think it's called A Companion to Marx's Capital. A Companion to Marx's Capital. And then there is another book called A Companion to Marx's Capital, Volume 2. But if you read the first one, that is probably like one of the better like books to get started in understanding, like if you really want to understand like how the world got to the way it is. If you want one that's a little bit more close to like with real world examples about stuff that's going on right now, he has another book called I think it's called like Neoliberalism. It's a book about A Brief History of Neoliberalism. It's a little old right now because it came out in 2005, so it's like 20 years old, but it does a really good job of explaining the sort of everything I talked about like the increasing inequalities and the breakdown of like the grand bargain and all that kind of stuff, and seeing the capitalist economic system as sort of a impersonal cybernetic organism that is just trying to maximize profit at the expense of everything. So like honestly, I find like David Harvey is the best like person to get started on theory in a lot of ways. But also, for if you don't want to read another book though, maybe we are actually, if there, maybe there's like actually like a whole, because I don't actually think I couldn't think off the top of my head of like a really good YouTuber / like content creator who really gets into the juice of like, historical materialism and Marx and stuff like that. But if you know one, please let me know.
I'm not either. I'm not immediately thinking of someone who does, also someone who isn't just like a professor posting their lectures, like who like does it in an engaging, interesting way. Maybe Michael Burns, who used to be at Wisecrack and now, but I think he's kind of doing a slightly different focus, but it's kind of related.
Oh, here, there's a really good one. There's a TikTok account that I was a really big fan of, where he's like I think he's like a British podcaster, but he's made these like these TikTok videos where he does a viral TikTok dance followed by him explaining a little snippet about Marx. It's great.
There you go.
That's very TikTok.
Yeah, I was like, that might be one of the most TikTok things I've ever heard. I've heard in a while.
Yeah, I should find his account. It's here somewhere. Let me.
Well, let's do this for now. I'm gonna try to include all of these links in the description down below. Both the book and YouTube and TikTok, and also all the other sources we mentioned throughout the conversation. I mentioned the machine learning stuff. That's a whole other podcast, but like I had the podcast where I talked to different data scientists, including about how to break down complex concepts in a way to make sense for regular people. And I can link to some of that too. I've written articles about that, but that's aside. But like, I guess for now, thanks for taking the time to talk. And I hope you have a good rest of your evening where you don't have to deal with bedtime duties.
I think he's already asleep. But yeah, thank you. This is really nice. I haven't gotten to talk excitedly about Marxism in a while. So, yeah, this is a pleasure. Thank you, Stephen.
No problem.